On December 20th, 1943, high above the frozen fields of Nazi Germany, a young American bomber pilot named Charlie Brown should have died 3 times over. First, when flak tore through his B-17 flying fortress like tissue paper. Second, when German fighters shredded his plane until it resembled a flying scrapyard more than an aircraft. And third, when Luftwaffe Ace Franz Stigler pulled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 alongside the crippled bomber with his guns loaded and his finger resting on the trigger, only to make a decision that would haunt both men for 46 years until they finally met again and discovered that the 5 minutes they shared over enemy territory had been the most important moments of their entire lives. Charlie Brown was just 21 years old that bitter December morning. A farm boy from West Virginia who had joined the Army Air Corps with dreams of adventure, but had found instead the grinding horror of the air war over Europe, where American bombers flew in massive formations into walls of flak and swarms of German fighters, and young men burned or froze or fell screaming from the sky at a rate that meant a bomber crew had only a 1 in 4 chance of surviving their 25-mission tour. This was Charlie's first mission as an aircraft commander, leading his crew of 9 others in AB-17 nicknamed Olde Pub, and their target was an aircraft factory deep in Germany near the town of Bremen, a target so heavily defended that crews called missions their milk runs to hell. The mission had gone wrong from the start. They had arrived late to the formation after engine trouble, which meant they were straggling behind the main bomber stream, alone and vulnerable, like a wounded animal separated from the herd, and as they approached the target through a sky that bloomed with black flowers of exploding flak, Charlie felt the first hammer blows of shrapnel punch through the thin aluminum skin of his aircraft. The bombing run itself was chaos incarnate, with the plane bucking and shuddering as flak burst all around them, hot metal fragments screaming through the fuselage, and then they were away from the target, turning for home, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid, when the German fighters found them. They came out of the sun like wolves, Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, their wings lighting up with cannon fire, and Charlie's world exploded into a nightmare of screaming metal and dying men as 20mm cannon shells ripped through his bomber, knocking out 2 of his 4 engines, blowing away half the tail section, shattering the nose cone where his bombardier sat, and killing or wounding half his crew in the first seconds of the attack. The tail gunner, a kid from Ohio named Hugh Eckenrode, was unconscious and frozen in his shattered turret, his face covered in blood, while the ball turret gunner had to be cranked up manually because the hydraulics were gone, and the radio operator lay wounded in the fuselage, and Charlie himself took a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder but barely noticed it because he was fighting with every ounce of his strength to keep the dying bomber in the air. The German fighters made pass after pass, and Charlie could see the faces of the German pilots as they roared past. So close he could see their leather helmets and oxygen masks, and he knew with absolute certainty that he and his crew were about to die, that there was no way this shot-up, burning wreck could possibly make it back to England, and he began to pray, not for salvation but simply that the end would come quickly. But then something extraordinary happened. The German fighters broke off their attack and disappeared, and for a few minutes Charlie and his surviving crew members looked at each other in disbelief, wondering if this was some kind of miracle, not knowing that they had dropped so low, down to just a few hundred feet above the German countryside, that the German fighter controllers had assumed they were going down and called off the attack, not wanting to waste ammunition on a plane that was clearly doomed. Franz Stigler, meanwhile, was just landing his Messerschmitt at a German fighter base near Bremen, taxiing in after a morning patrol, when the field telephone rang with a message that a crippled American bomber was limping across German territory at low altitude, and would any fighters in the area please go up and finish it off. Franz was 28 years old, a veteran fighter pilot with 27 confirmed kills, just 2 short of the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor, and this crippled bomber would be easy prey, his 28th kill, perhaps even his 29th if he could claim it as 2 victories. He took off immediately, climbing into the cold December sky, his hunting instincts sharp, and within minutes he spotted the B-17, flying so low it was almost brushing the treetops, trailing smoke and fuel, clearly dying, and Franz dove down to make his kill, coming up fast behind the bomber, his finger moving to the gun button, when suddenly he pulled alongside and looked into the waist windows of the American plane and saw something that stopped his heart. What Franz saw was carnage. The entire tail section was shot away, the rear gunner unconscious or dead in his turret, the waist gunners wounded and trying desperately to swing their guns toward him but moving as if in a dream, too injured to be a threat, and through the shattered nose cone he could see the navigator and bombardier, one clearly dead, the other trying to help his wounded comrades, and Franz realized with a shock that this wasn't a warplane anymore. It was a flying coffin full of wounded and dying boys, and shooting them down would not be combat, it would be murder. Franz had been a fighter pilot since before the war, had fought in North Africa and in the defense of Germany, had shot down bombers and fighters, had seen friends die and had killed enemies, but he had always fought with honor, had been taught by his commanding officer, a man named Gustav Rodel, that there were rules to warfare, that even in the sky you fought with chivalry, that you never shot a man in a parachute, never strafed pilots in the water, never kicked a man when he was down. Gustav had told him once, repeating the words of his own mentor, "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself." And those words had stayed with Franz throughout the war, had become part of his code, his sense of honor, and now, looking at this shattered American bomber, he knew that shooting it down would violate everything he believed in, would make him no better than a murderer, would be something he could never wash from his soul. So Franz Stigler made a decision that could have gotten him court-martialed and shot. Instead of attacking the American bomber, he pulled his Messerschmitt alongside it, close enough that Charlie Brown, looking out his left window, nearly had a heart attack when he saw the German fighter there, the black crosses stark on its wings, the pilot looking directly at him. Charlie thought this was it, thought the German was positioning for the kill shot, and he waited for the cannon fire that would end everything, but it never came. Instead, Franz began to wave at Charlie, gesturing frantically toward the ground, toward Sweden, trying to communicate through hand signals that Charlie should land in Germany. Or fly to neutral Sweden, trying to save these Americans' lives by getting them to surrender. Charlie, his mind reeling, couldn't understand what was happening. Why wasn't this German shooting at them? Why was he flying in formation with them? It made no sense, violated everything Charlie knew about aerial combat, and he kept expecting treachery, kept expecting other German fighters to appear, but Franz simply stayed there, flying wingtip to wingtip with the shattered bomber, and slowly Charlie understood that this German pilot, this enemy ace, was trying to help them. Franz escorted the B-17 across German territory, flying so close that German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground couldn't fire without hitting both planes, using his presence to shield the Americans from further attack. And when they reached the German coast, the cold North Sea stretching before them, Franz pulled alongside one more time, looked directly at Charlie Brown, saluted, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another, and then peeled away, diving back toward Germany, leaving the Americans to make their desperate flight across the sea. Charlie somehow nursed the dying bomber back across the North Sea to England, crash-landing at the first airfield he could find. The plane so badly damaged that it was immediately scrapped, never to fly again, and when the crew climbed out, shaking and in shock, the ground crews who saw the damage couldn't believe anyone had survived. One mechanic counted more than 500 holes in the aircraft. Charlie tried to tell his debriefing officer about the German pilot who had saved them, but he was told to keep quiet about it, that it was too incredible, too strange, that it might be used as propaganda by the Germans, and so Charlie stayed silent, but he never forgot, never stopped thinking about the German ace who had spared his life when he could have killed him. Franz Stigler, meanwhile, returned to his base and said nothing about what he had done, knowing that if anyone found out he had let an American bomber escape, he could face a firing squad for treason, and he carried the secret through the rest of the war, through the collapse of Nazi Germany, through his years in post-war Germany where he struggled to rebuild his life, immigrating eventually to Canada where he became a successful businessman, all the while wondering what had happened to the American crew, whether they had made it home, whether any of them had survived the war. 46 years passed, 46 years during which both men lived full lives, raised families, grew old, and yet both carried the memory of that December day in 1943. Charlie haunted by the image of the German pilot who had saved him, Franz haunted by the faces of those wounded American boys in the bomber, and it wasn't until 1986, when Charlie Brown was retired and living in Florida, that he decided he had to try to find the German pilot, had to know who he was, had to thank him for a gift that had given Charlie 46 years of life, a wife, children, grandchildren, an entire existence that would never have been if not for that moment of mercy over Germany. Charlie began a search that seemed impossible. How do you find one German fighter pilot among thousands? From an event 4 decades past, with no name, no squadron, no records? Charlie wrote to German fighter pilot associations, placed ads in newsletters, sent letters to anyone who might help, and for years he heard nothing, just dead ends and false leads, and he began to think he would die without ever knowing who had saved him. But then, in 1990, Charlie received a letter from Canada, from a man named Franz Stigler, who had seen one of Charlie's notices and who wrote, I was the one. And proceeded to describe in detail Charlie's damaged bomber, the injured crew, the exact route they had flown, details that only the German pilot who had been there could have known. Charlie's hands shook as he read the letter, tears streaming down his face, and he immediately called Franz, and when the two men spoke for the first time, they both wept, not just for themselves but for all the years lost, for all the men who hadn't survived, for the waste and horror of war and the rare moments of grace that transcend it. They arranged to meet in person, and when Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler finally stood face to face in 1990, two old men in their 70s, they embraced like brothers, and from that moment until their deaths. Franz in 2008 and Charlie in 2008, just months apart. They were inseparable friends, attending air shows together, telling their story to schools and veteran groups, appearing in documentaries, writing a book together, traveling the world to spread a message about honor and humanity and the choices we make even in the midst of war. They told audiences about that December day in 1943, about how Franz had been taught that honor meant something even when no one was watching, about how Charlie had been given a gift he spent 46 years trying to repay, about how in the midst of a war that killed 60 million people, one German pilot chose mercy over orders, chose his conscience over his career, chose to see the humanity in his enemies rather than just targets to be destroyed. Franz would explain, in his thick German accent, that he had simply done what his mentor had taught him, that he couldn't shoot at defenseless men, that it would have been murder, not combat, and Charlie would describe how seeing Franz's Messerschmitt pull alongside his dying plane had been the most terrifying and then the most inexplicable moment of his life, how he had gone from certain death to impossible salvation in a heartbeat. Their story became famous, a tale of chivalry in an age of total war, proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, individuals can choose grace over violence, can refuse to dehumanize their enemies, can risk everything for what they believe is right. And when Franz and Charlie told their story, they always emphasized that they weren't heroes, they were just men who had been swept up in events larger than themselves, but that everyone faces moments when they must choose between what is easy and what is right, between following orders and following conscience, and that these choices define who we are. In their final years, when both men were in their 80s, they remained close, calling each other regularly, visiting when they could, and they often reflected on the strange miracle that had brought them together. That a moment of mercy in 1943 had created a friendship that lasted until death, that 5 minutes over Germany had bound them more tightly than families or nations or anything else in their lives. When Franz Stigler died in March 2008 at age 92, Charlie Brown was devastated, and he told friends that he felt like he had lost a brother, that Franz had given him not just his life but something more precious. Proof that even in war, even when the world demands you become a killer, you can choose to remain human, can choose to see the person behind the uniform, the life behind the target. Charlie Brown followed his friend in death just 8 months later, in November 2008, at age 87. And those who knew both men said that Charlie had been waiting, that he couldn't bear to be separated from Franz for long, that the bond between them transcended normal friendship and had become something almost spiritual, a connection forged in fire and fear and sustained by gratitude and mutual respect. Their story lives on now in books and documentaries, in the memories of their families, in the lessons taught to new generations of pilots and soldiers about the importance of honor and the power of mercy. And whenever their tale is told, people are moved by the same questions. Would I have the courage to do what Franz Stigler did, to risk everything for a principle, to spare an enemy when I had every right and reason to kill? Would I be able to see past my orders, my training, my hatred of the enemy, to recognize shared humanity? And would I, like Charlie Brown, spend decades searching for someone who had shown me mercy, driven by a debt that could never truly be repaid but had to be acknowledged? The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler reminds us that war, for all its mechanized horror and industrial-scale killing, still comes down to individual human beings making individual human choices, and that sometimes, in the frozen sky above a dying world, when everything we are and everything we could be hangs in the balance, we are capable of extraordinary grace, capable of seeing the face of God in the face of our enemy, capable of choosing life over death, mercy over justice, love over hate, and that such choices, though they may go unrecognized for decades, echo through time and change not just two lives but everyone who hears the story and is forced to confront the question. When my moment comes, when I have power over another human being's life, when no one is watching and I could kill without consequence, what will I choose? The German ace and the American pilot, enemies who became brothers, teach us that the answer to that question defines not just who we are, but who we might become, and that mercy, once given, creates ripples that spread outward through time, touching lives and changing hearts long after the merciful and the spared have both passed into memory.